200,000, 300,000. The exact figure is a matter of historical debate, but the mechanics of the kill are not. On December 13, 1937, 2 years before the German military crossed the Polish border, the Imperial Japanese Army breached the walls of the Chinese capital, Nanking. The defense of the city had collapsed. The retreating Chinese forces left behind a population of hundreds of thousands of civilians and a large contingent of disarmed soldiers. What followed was not a byproduct of combat. It was a structured, systematic eradication of a civilian population. The Second World War, in its most absolute and documented form, had already begun in Asia. The scale of the violence in Nanking established a precedent for the decade of industrialized slaughter that would follow. The Japanese entry into the city was immediate. The soldiers moved through the streets in ordered formations, clearing neighborhoods block by block. The initial phase involved the identification and segregation of military-aged men. Chinese soldiers who had discarded their uniforms were pulled from the refugee crowds. Civilians were not distinguished from combatants. The Japanese command had issued orders to eliminate all captured military personnel, a directive that was interpreted on the ground as a mandate to eliminate all men of fighting age, regardless of their actual status. The execution logistics were methodical. The primary killing ground was the banks of the Yangtze River. Japanese soldiers corralled groups ranging from dozens to thousands of men, bound their hands with wire or rope, and marched them to the water's edge. The executions were carried out with machine guns. The bodies were disposed of in the river. The current carried them downstream. The water became choked with corpses. The mechanical process of lining up civilians, shooting them, and dumping them into the river repeated continuously for days. Simultaneously, a secondary execution protocol was operating inside the city limits. Squads of Japanese infantry moved door to door through the residential districts. They entered homes, dragged out the men, and killed them in the streets or inside the courtyards. The methods varied. Bayonets were used frequently to conserve ammunition. Swords were employed for summary beheadings. The house-to-house sweeps ensured that no male population center within the city limits remained untouched. Alongside the mass executions, the Japanese military utilized a third vector of violence: sexual assault. Historians and international tribunals later concluded that the sexual violence in Nanking was not spontaneous criminality by individual soldiers, but an organized component of the occupation strategy. Women and girls of all ages were targeted. Soldiers entered homes, safety shelters, and public buildings to locate victims. The assaults were often fatal. Many victims were killed during or immediately after the attacks to eliminate witnesses and prevent the spread of disease within the ranks. The exact number of sexual assaults is impossible to quantify due to the high mortality rate of the victims and the subsequent destruction of municipal records, but contemporary documentation confirms the scale was in the tens of thousands. Inside the besieged city, a small foreign contingent attempted to establish a perimeter of immunity. John Rabe, a German businessman and member of the Nazi Party, remained in Nanking during the occupation. Leveraging his status as a German national, and therefore a citizen of Japan's Allied power, Rabe established the Nanking Safety Zone. He, along with a network of American missionaries and European expatriates, designated a 2.5 square mile area of the city as a neutral, non-combatant zone. Rabe and the others physically intervened to stop executions. They confronted Japanese patrols, placed their own bodies between soldiers and civilians, and documented the killings in written diaries and photographic evidence. The safety zone ultimately sheltered approximately 200,000 Chinese civilians. However, the zone was not sovereign territory. The Japanese military did not officially recognize its neutral status. Minnie Vautrin, an American missionary, operated a refugee camp for women at Jinling College. Japanese soldiers breached the perimeter of the college repeatedly over the 6-week period. They entered the dormitories, searched the rooms, and dragged women away. Vautrin and her staff physically blocked doors and argued with armed soldiers, but the incursions continued. The safety zone slowed the killing. It did not stop it. The foreigners provided a localized false hope. Survival inside the zone was contingent on the fluctuating discipline of the Japanese patrols, not on any binding international agreement. The Japanese military command was aware of the violence. The cover-up began concurrently with the massacres. Soldiers were ordered to bury bodies in mass graves to obscure the scale of the killing. The Japanese Foreign Ministry actively suppressed reports leaving the city. When accounts of the massacre reached Western media outlets via the smuggled diaries of Rabe and other foreigners, the Japanese government dismissed them as Allied propaganda and fabricated photographs. The accountability for Nanking was delayed by the duration of the war. Following the Japanese surrender in 1945, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in Tokyo. The tribunal processed evidence regarding the Nanking Massacre. Prince Yasuhiko Asaka, the commanding officer in the field, was granted immunity by the United States due to his royal status and was never prosecuted. General Iwane Matsui, the overall commander of the expeditionary force, was convicted of war crimes for failing to prevent the atrocities committed by his subordinates. He was executed by hanging in 1948. Lieutenant General Tani Hisao, the commander of the 16th Division, which was heavily involved in the river executions, was tried separately by a Chinese tribunal and executed in 1947. Despite the tribunals, the historical resolution of the Nanking Massacre remains incomplete. In the decades following the war, factions within the Japanese political establishment initiated a campaign of historical revisionism. Official government statements were issued downplaying the death toll. Textbooks were altered to remove or minimize references to the massacre. The denial of the events at Nanking evolved into a continuous point of diplomatic friction between Japan and China. The massacre demonstrated that the documentation of an atrocity does not automatically result in universal acceptance of its reality. The violence in Nanking was characterized by immediate, physical destruction. It required the sustained presence of thousands of soldiers executing civilians at close range. The Imperial Japanese Army subsequently developed a method of mass killing that eliminated the need for large-scale troop deployments, opting instead for biological and chemical vectors. This program was designated Unit 731. Between 1936 and 1945, the Japanese Imperial Army operated a covert biological and chemical warfare research facility in occupied Manchuria, near the city of Harbin. The facility was commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist. The complex was externally disguised as an epoxy water purification plant and a lumber mill. Internally, it functioned as a human experimentation laboratory. The subjects used in Unit 731 were referred to internally as Maryuta, meaning logs. The terminology was logistical. The prisoners were not classified as humans, they were classified as raw material. The supply of logs consisted of Chinese civilians, Korean resistance fighters, Soviet prisoners of war, and other individuals deemed enemies of the state. Local police and military units continuously supplied the facility with new subjects. Estimates of the total number of people killed inside the Unit 731 complex range from 10,000 to over 20,000. Field tests conducted by the unit across China killed tens of thousands more. The experiments were designed to generate usable data for the Japanese military's biological weapons program. The research required observing the progression of diseases and physical trauma in living human subjects. Anesthesia was not administered to the subjects during experimentation. Ishii and his staff argued that the use of anesthetics would alter the physiological data they were attempting to collect. The primary focus of Unit 731 was the vector transmission of infectious diseases. Subjects were injected with or force-fed pathogens including Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid. The medical staff monitored the subjects as the infections progressed. They documented the onset of symptoms, the failure of internal organs, and the time of death. When a subject died or when their condition required direct observation of the internal organs, they were subjected to vivisection. Vivisection is the practice of conducting surgical operations on living organisms. At Unit 731, the subjects were placed on surgical tables, restrained, and cut open while conscious. The medical staff removed organs, dissected brain tissue, and examined the ravages of the artificially induced diseases on living tissue. The subjects died on the operating table. Their remains were subsequently incinerated in the facility's crematorium. The process was assembly line medicine, inverted to function as a killing mechanism. Disease vectors were only one aspect of the research. Unit 731 conducted extensive experiments on the physical limits of the human body under extreme environmental stress. Frostbite research was a primary directive, intended to develop treatments for Japanese soldiers operating in the harsh winter conditions of northern China and Siberia. Subjects were led outside in the depths of the Manchurian winter. Their arms or legs were exposed and doused with water. The ambient temperature, which regularly dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, froze the limbs solid. The medical staff then tested various methods of thawing the frozen tissue to determine the most effective treatment. They used cold water, hot water, and forced air heating. They recorded the exact temperatures, the duration of the thawing process, and the resulting tissue necrosis. In many cases, the frozen limbs were struck with blunt instruments to test the brittleness of the bone and tissue. The frostbite experiments routinely resulted in gangrene and mandatory amputation. The facility also housed pressure chambers. Subjects were placed inside the chambers, and the atmospheric pressure was systematically lowered to simulate high-altitude conditions. The goal was to determine at what exact pressure the human body succumbed to hypoxia, and to observe the physical effects of rapid decompression. Staff documented the moment the subject's eyes bulged from their sockets due to the pressure differential, and the time it took for the lungs to rupture. Other experiments tested the efficacy of conventional weapons. Subjects were strapped to wooden stakes at varying distances from explosive charges. Grenades, artillery shells, and flamethrowers were detonated or directed at the stakes. The resulting shrapnel patterns and burn trajectories were recorded. The data was used to calculate the optimal standoff distances for infantry engagements. The research at Unit 731 was not confined to the laboratory. The unit developed biological weapons for deployment in the field. They manufactured porcelain bombs designed to shatter on impact, dispersing infected fleas carrying the bubonic plague into civilian populations. Between 1940 and 1942, Unit 731 conducted field operations in China. Aircraft dropped the porcelain bombs over cities and towns, including Ningbo and Changde. The bombings triggered localized plague outbreaks. The Chinese civilian populations, lacking immunity and medical infrastructure, suffered high mortality rates. The field tests confirmed that biological weapons could be effectively deployed against large geographic areas. The systemic operation of Unit 731 relied on absolute compartmentalization. The subjects entered the facility and were never seen again. The crematoriums ran continuously. The local population knew the facility was a place of death, but the specific scientific protocols were hidden behind military cordons. In August 1945, as the Soviet Red Army advanced into Manchuria, the Japanese command ordered the destruction of Unit 731. Shiro Ishii oversaw the demolition. The remaining logs were executed. The buildings were blown up with explosives. The evidence of the biological weapons program was buried or burned. Ishii and his senior staff fled back to Japan. The aftermath of Unit 731 diverged entirely from the legal framework established at Nuremberg and Tokyo. The United States military, having anticipated the strategic value of biological weapons data in the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union, intercepted Ishii and his key personnel. The U.S. government, through the Office of General Douglas MacArthur, initiated a secret intelligence exchange. The terms of the exchange were explicit. In return for full access to the data generated by Unit 731, including the human experimentation data on plague, frostbite, and weapon effectiveness, the United States granted total immunity to Shiro Ishii and the entire leadership of the unit. No member of Unit 731 was ever prosecuted for war crimes. The data was integrated into the U.S. biological weapons program at Fort Detrick, Maryland. The Soviet Union, which had captured some lower-ranking Unit 731 personnel during the Manchurian invasion, conducted the Khabarovsk war crime trials in 1949. The Soviets sentenced 12 captured Japanese soldiers to hard labor. However, the primary architects of the program, protected by the American Immunity Agreement, were never subjected to international tribunal. Shiro Ishii lived in Japan until his death from natural causes in 1959. He was never arrested. He never stood trial. The scientific data extracted from the vivisection of thousands of conscious human beings became a foundational asset in the Cold War biological arms race. The historical trajectory of World War II is often defined by its grand strategic movements. The sweeping advances across continents, the naval engagements in the Pacific, the aerial bombardments of European cities. Beneath the strategic layer exists the operational reality of occupation and conquest. The events at Nanking and the operations of Unit 731 represent the intersection of military bureaucracy and unchecked physical violence. Nanking demonstrated that the removal of legal and social constraints allows a standing army to revert to a mechanism of mass execution within hours of breaching a city limit. Unit 731 demonstrated that the scientific method, stripped of ethical limitations, can be weaponized to transform human beings into measurable data points. The outcomes of both events shared a common characteristic: systemic failure of accountability. The tribunals in Tokyo executed a handful of senior commanders but failed to establish an uncompromised historical record, allowing revisionism to take root. The secret immunity granted to Unit 731 by the U.S. government prioritized strategic intelligence over legal justice, effectively validating the premise that human experimentation could yield usable, state-sanctioned intelligence assets. The Second World War ended in 1945. The legal frameworks designed to process the atrocities of that conflict, the Geneva Conventions, the International Criminal Courts, were constructed in direct response to the events that preceded them. But the foundational mechanics of those atrocities, the categorization of human beings as logistical obstacles or raw materials, the deployment of state resources to facilitate their destruction, and the subsequent manipulation of the historical record to obscure the perpetrator's actions, remain established protocols in the continued application of state-sponsored violence.